Okay, we're going to continue our look at the time and expense module. And briefly, we mentioned in our last video that there were ways to get a more detailed look at your time and expense entries. So, where that is done is in our time and expense module, here on our Details tab. And we can obviously just click in there and then enter a new time entry, or in fact, even pull up an old one. But also, there is a shortcut. So, we mentioned this briefly in our first video, but we'll go back and look at the sample time entry we entered on the Bradford Lake House. So we've selected the day that we entered it on here, and we can see it here on our list on the bottom. If we actually click on that entry, that will bring it back up into our main list here into an edit mode where we can actually update it if we wish to. But in this case, we don't want to do that. What we do want to do is mouse over it and highlight it, and then click on this little square icon on the left. This is actually an icon that shows a picture of a piece of paper and a little pencil. If we click on that, then it will automatically bring us into that Details tab and load that time entry in. And from this screen, we can see that there are quite a few more options here. So just to first cover the fields that are required, that you have to have for a time entry to be considered complete. Okay, so the first four fields, employee, project, phase, and job code, are all required fields. The date is also a required field. The number of hours is required and must be greater than 0. And the bill rate is required and must be greater than 0. If any of these is missing, such as if, for instance, we did not have a job code, we would see something like this. So the program will actually show us that it's incomplete, and we'll know that there's something wrong that we need to take a look at. And in fact, if we go back to our time tab very briefly, we can see these same little icons on the far right-hand edge of our list here. We can see the check mark, which represents a complete entry. We see there's one that's currently on a draft invoice for a little D. And if there were any that were incomplete, we would see that as well. We also have a selection here for time and or expense, depending on which one we're entering. And we can see that certain fields change as needed to allow you to enter whichever of those you're doing. There's also an optional role. This is usually useful in reporting in most cases. So you can optionally put in, and in fact this can default from the preferences setting in your project itself, from the team that you've defined, what role this person is playing on this particular project. And then you can use that role as a criteria later on to run a time and expense report based on roles, or even sort a time and expense report based on roles. So that's what that is used for. Also, we briefly mentioned in our prior video that if you do have a project defined to use tasks, that this task description box plays a dual role that changes depending on that setting. So there is a manifestation that appears on this screen as well based on that setting. So you can see right now that we just have a blank space here that seems somewhat out of place. Well, the reason for that is because there actually is a field there. So if we do in fact go back to our Bradford Lake House and we turn on the Use Tasks for Time setting and save our change, then when we go back into our Details tab and we look at that slip, now you can see that in fact there is a task field there. And this will work just like it will on the other tab, where it will show you a list of all the predefined task types and tasks that you have defined on that project. So that's just another level of organization and cataloging of your time entries. The task is completely optional. We also have, as you would expect, the hours and rate fields. And I will come back to those in just a moment. Moving on to a couple of other fields, we have a rate type. 99% of the time, this will be left on employee. And this simply means that it will use the rate that is predefined in the project team for this project. And it will populate that rate in the rate box and multiply that by the hours to determine the total value of the slip. However, there are situations that you might run into where you'll have a time entry that has a set value regardless of how many hours the person put in to work on it. So you can do that. So we could change this to, say, 4 hours. And we can say, well, this slip is worth $300. And instead of seeing the typical $1,200 value we would expect from 4 hours at $300 an hour, we in fact see that the value we put in the rate box is the final value. So that is what this actually does. And you'll see if we change it back to employee, then of course it recalculates to 1,200. We also have a charge status. Again, most of the time, most entries will be charge. However, there is an option for no charge. Now, this is not to be confused with the non-reimbursable option that is available on expenses. What this means is this time entry will be billed. It will be on your invoice, it will show up, it will be viewable by your customer, but it will have a value of 0. And this can be used for any number of reasons, but the most common would be if, for instance, you have time that you want to show to your customer that, yes, we did this work for you, but for whatever reason, we've decided we're not going to actually charge you for that time, but we still want you to know that we worked it. So you can do that. You can also set the charge status to hold. So perhaps you need to record an employee's time for payroll purposes, but for right now, for whatever reason, you just don't want to invoice this entry at all. It doesn't show up on the invoice, it does not contribute value, it doesn't do anything. It just sits in the system on hold until such time as you decide that you now are ready to invoice it, or if perhaps you have a reason that you wish to never invoice it. You can simply leave it on hold forever. We also have a box for a description. This description will appear on invoices if they are in certain formats. So this will be viewable by your customer. And then notes. Notes similar to description, except this is strictly an internal field. So this will actually not be viewable on your invoices and will not be viewable by your customers. There's also a cost rate. So this will automatically default based on the cost rate for this employee as defined in preferences, or the cost rate for the expense type if this is an expense entry. So when we go to an expense entry, we have an additional field here where we can specify, well, what type of expense is it? And these expense types are all defined in preferences. And we can set in preferences a default cost rate, a default bill rate, and a default quantity. And if we had set a cost rate on our blueprinting, perhaps we know that our blueprinting always costs us $20 per blueprint. So we can actually set that cost rate so that it defaults in preferences automatically. If, however, you do have a reason to need to change it, that option is here. So you can simply begin the entry of your expense, click on cost rate, type in the new rate, and it will record that. Similar mechanism with tax. So this field will automatically default when you create a new entry based on the tax settings in this individual project. This particular project was configured for no tax, so this slip inherited the same rate. But if we had set a tax on this project, it would have automatically defaulted like so. And if we then put in a value, we can see now that the tax is set to actually apply to this entry, we do in fact show an increased value of $107. couple of other things, specifically with expenses, since we're already here. We have actually 4 options here. So we have our employee reimbursable, which we touched on in our first video. So we can mark that. And then we also have an option if we do in fact say that yes, this is an employee reimbursable expense, then we also get an additional option to say, well, have we yet paid out that expense back to this employee? If we have, then we can simply track that by checking this box. We also have the ability, as we touched on in the first video, to say, well, this expense is not going to be billed to the client at all. It's non-reimbursable. So it will not appear on the invoice, it will not contribute value, but it will be marked billed, it will be accounted for. So it will not be encapsulated in future invoices. It has been addressed, and we have chosen to address it by saying that we will not be billing this expense ever. And then we can say whether or not we want this expense to be subject to markup. So we can set at our project level what percentage or flat value of markup we want all of our expenses to have. And then just as cost rate can default from a setting in preferences based on our expense type, we have a similar mechanism for the apply markup. So we can predefine these expense types in preferences to say, for example, that we always want to mark up our blueprinting expenses. So we can in fact set that in preferences so that when we're entering a new expense, as soon as we select this option, this box will automatically be checked for us. So we don't really have to think about it. It makes the entry of the expense just that little bit faster and that little bit easier, and allows you to not have to worry about it and worry that you're going to forget to set that. So that is how that's done. And then one of the last things I want to mention is the approved box. So this is in fact optional. In ArchiOffice or Engineer Office, slips do not necessarily have to be approved. Whether or not each individual project requires an approval process is completely optional and completely up to you. But if you do wish to do that, where that is done is in the project itself, and you go into your Slips tab, and you'll see an option here, Slips Require Approval. So this tells the system that on this project, any time or expense entry that we enter, before it will be allowed to be captured by the invoice, it has to be approved by someone. Well, who can approve it? Well, in the definition of the project's team, you'll see all of your team members for that project, and we can actually say, well, who actually has approval authority for time and expense entries? So we can actually set that. And what we will see is this approved checkbox will appear. And this box will only be visible to the people on the team for this specific project, and only if we are actually logged in as one of those people and that person actually has approval authority. So if we are not logged in as one of those people, or if we are logged in as someone who just does not have approval authority, or if the project itself just doesn't require an approval process, then this entire box will just not be there. And then the final thing I want to point out here is the day viewer. This is an enterprise-only feature, but the day viewer is simply a very quick and dirty filter that allows you to locate a pre-entered time or expense entry so that perhaps you need to make changes. Perhaps you need to make change to several time entries. Maybe you have a new employee and they're not quite up to speed on the project yet, and they made a couple of mistakes that you need to fix. So you can very easily set a filter here, get a list of the time or expense entries that meet that filter, and then you can click on one and very easily now instantly be looking at that time and expense entry and make whatever changes we need, save our changes up at the top, and then we're good to go. And then very briefly, the last thing I want to look at is the filter tab. And as the name suggests, it is just that. It is a much more in-depth filter similar to the day viewer, except there are many more options. And the goal here is to allow you a very simple way to find time and expense entries in the system so that you can open them, look at them, make changes, or what have you. And you have a whole host of filters here that we can use to do that. The status, whether it's approved, completed, already billed, whether it's time or expense, who it's entered by. We can even select a date range. So that is the filter tab, and that is all we're going to look at today on the time and expense tab.